There is a particular kind of horror in a body without a name. A murder at least has a shape to it, a victim, a story, people who loved them, and who will not rest until someone answers for it. But a nameless body has none of that. It is a person erased twice. Once when they were killed, and again when the world simply forgot they had ever existed. In the woods of New Hampshire, near a place called Brook State Park, there were 4 of them. A woman and 3 little girls, sealed inside 2 metal barrels and left in the trees. For more than 30 years, no one came looking. No one filed the reports. No one knew their names, not the woman's, not the children's, not even how they were connected to each other. They were just bones in a drum, a case number, a sketch on a flyer that no one recognized. This is the story of how 3 decades later, science finally gave them back their names, and how the same breakthrough that named the victims also unmasked one of the most elusive killers America never knew it had. To understand how 4 people could vanish so completely, you have to go back to a cold November day in 1985, and to the man who almost got away with all of it. On the 10th of November, 1985, a hunter was moving through the woods near Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, when he found something that did not belong. It was a metal drum, a 55-gallon barrel, the kind used to haul industrial liquids, and it had been left out there among the trees. Inside it were the remains of 2 people, an adult woman and a young girl, wrapped and hidden away. There were no identification papers, no missing persons report that matched. No frantic family calling the police to say a mother and her daughter had disappeared. In 1985, the science of the time could tell investigators a great deal about how these 2 had died, and almost nothing about who they were. And so, with no name and no thread to pull, the case did what so many cases from that era did. It went cold. There was a hard limit to what 1985 could do. There were no national DNA databases to speak of, no consumer ancestry sites, no way to take an unknown person's biology and turn it into a surname. A medical examiner could study the bones and estimate an age, a height, a window of time. But a body that no one reports missing is a body that the science of that decade simply could not name. Investigators did everything the era allowed. They worked the missing persons records, they chased the few leads the woods had offered up, and when all of it ran out, the 2 victims were laid to rest beneath a headstone that could not say who they were. And the woods of Allenstown kept their secret. What no one realized, what no one could have realized, is that the woods were not finished giving up the dead. 15 years passed. And then, in the year 2000, in the same patch of New Hampshire forest, investigators found a second barrel. Inside it were the remains of 2 more children. 2 more little girls, left exactly the way the first 2 had been left, sealed in a drum and abandoned in the trees, only a short distance from the first. Now there were 4. 1 woman and 3 children, all found in the same stretch of woods, all unidentified, all clearly the work of the same hand. And still, no one came forward. There was no community missing a mother and 3 girls. There was no family on the news, no reward poster, no anniversary vigil. It was as if these 4 people had been carved out of the world so cleanly that not a single person had noticed they were gone. Investigators gave them the only name they could, the Allenstown 4. They built composite images of what the victims might have looked like in life and sent them out into the world, hoping someone, somewhere, would feel a jolt of recognition. For years, no one did. There were composite sketches, artists' best attempts to reconstruct the faces of a woman and 3 girls from the shape of their skulls, and those faces appeared on flyers and in the occasional news story, staring out at a public that had never met them. Detectives followed the handful of tips that came in. They re-examined the barrels, the wrappings, every fiber the scene had preserved. And every promising thread led back to the same impossible dead end. 4 people who, on paper, did not seem to exist at all. Think about what that silence actually means. It means a killer had chosen his victims so carefully, people so isolated, so cut off from anyone who would miss them, that he could erase an entire family and leave no ripple at all. That was not luck. That was method. And it tells you something about who he chose. The people most vulnerable to a predator like this are not the ones with big families and steady jobs and 100 people who would notice a missing Sunday phone call. They are the ones on the margins, the ones who have drifted from home, who have cut ties, who are passing through. A mother and her young children, far from anyone who knew them, were exactly the kind of victims a man like this looked for, precisely because their disappearance would cost him nothing. The same isolation that made them vulnerable in life is what made them invisible in death. If the idea of 4 people vanishing without a single person noticing is sitting heavy with you, a quick like helps this story reach more people, because what finally cracked this case open did not exist when these victims were found, and it has since changed true crime forever. For decades, the Allenstown Four were a wall that investigators could not climb. They had DNA from the victims, but DNA on its own is just a code. It can tell you that 2 people are related, but it cannot tell you their names. To turn that code into an identity, you need something to compare it to. And then, in the 2010s, a new technique arrived that would rewrite the rules of cold case work entirely. It is called investigative genetic genealogy, and the idea behind it is deceptively simple. You take the unknown DNA, and instead of searching a police database, you search the vast public family trees that ordinary people had been building through consumer ancestry sites. You do not look for the person themselves. You look for their distant cousins, and then you work backward, branch by branch, until the family tree narrows to a single name. It is painstaking, slow, deeply human work, less like a computer spitting out a match and more like a historian rebuilding a shattered family from a handful of surviving fragments. You might begin with a distant cousin who shares only a sliver of DNA, and from that single thread you build outward. Marriages, births, census records, obituaries, old newspaper clippings, until a sprawling family tree takes shape, and, somewhere out on one of its far branches, an unexplained gap appears. A person who should be there and isn't. In the Brook case, that work was driven not only by professionals, but by a citizen sleuth, an ordinary person who refused to let the Allenstown Four stay nameless, and who poured countless hours into chasing those branches toward the truth. In 2017, that method did something it had never done before. Working the Brook case, investigators used genetic genealogy to identify, for the very first time in history, a criminal suspect. It was the first time the technique had ever been used that way. The spark that would go on to crack hundreds of cold cases across the country. And the name it produced belonged to a man who had spent his entire life making sure no one would ever find it. Because here's the twist that makes Brook so unforgettable. The science did not just name the killer. It revealed that the man who left 4 bodies in the New Hampshire woods had been hiding in plain sight for decades, under so many different names that he had a nickname of his own. They called him the Chameleon. Take 1 second to subscribe before this next part, because the man at the center of this case, and the final victim no one could identify, turned this from a murder mystery into something far stranger and sadder. His real name was Terry Peter Rasmussen, but almost no one had ever known him by it. Across years and across states, he had moved through other people's lives under a parade of false identities, and the one stitched most tightly to this case was a man called Bob Evans. He would arrive in a community, attach himself to a woman, become part of her world, and then, when it suited him, disappear and become someone else entirely. That is how he earned the name investigators gave him, the Chameleon Killer. And the genealogy that named him also began to reveal the trail of damage he had left behind. Around 1981, he had been romantically involved with a woman named Denise Bowden. Not long after, Denise vanished, along with her infant daughter. Her body has never been found, and she is presumed dead. Another life this man appears to have erased. The child, though, survived. She was raised by him under a name that was not her own, and it was only years later, when she came forward as an adult, that investigators began to understand just how long Rasmussen had been operating and how many identities he had worn. Picture that for a moment. A young woman who had grown up believing one story about who she was and where she came from, only to learn as an adult that the man who raised her was not who he claimed to be, that he was, in all likelihood, tied to the disappearance of her own mother, and to a string of killings stretching across the country. Her willingness to come forward and to give her DNA became one of the quiet keys that let investigators begin to map the chameleon's true history. The truth in this case never arrived in a single dramatic moment. It was assembled, slowly and painfully, out of the courage of the people he had hurt and the patience of the people who refused to stop looking for the ones he had thrown away. The chameleon himself was never tried for Bear Brook. By the time genetic genealogy caught up with him, he was already gone. He had died in prison in 2010, where he was serving time for a different murder in another state, under yet another version of himself. That, in the end, is what makes the chameleon so chilling. Not a single spectacular act, but the sheer, patient durability of his disguise. He had moved through the country for decades, shedding names the way other people change clothes, leaving behind missing women and unanswered questions in more than one state. The reason he was so hard to catch was not that he was a genius. It was that he understood, better than almost anyone, that a person without a paper trail is very nearly invisible, and that a victim no one is looking for is a crime that may never be investigated at all. He took most of his secrets with him, but he could not take the names of his victims, because the names were written in their blood, and the science had finally learned to read them. And one by one, the Allenstown Four stopped being numbers and became people again. In 2019, helped by the genealogist Barbara Rae-Venter and a tireless volunteer investigator named Becky Heath, 3 of the 4 victims were finally named. The woman in the first barrel was Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. She was 24 years old. The young girl found with her was her daughter, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, who was 6. And one of the children in the second barrel was Marlise's other daughter, Sarah Lynn McWaters, who was just 1 year old. A mother and her 2 little girls, last seen alive in California in 1978. For more than 40 years, they had been missing without anyone realizing they were missing. And now, at last, they had their names back. But there was still one child left, one little girl found in that second barrel who did not fit. Because when investigators tested her DNA against the others, she was not related to Marlise or her daughters at all. She belonged to someone else. She was, the science showed, the biological daughter of the killer himself. It would take until 2025 and a partnership between the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit and a group called the DNA Doe Project to give her a name, too. She was Rae Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County, California, the daughter of Terry Rasmussen and a woman named Pepper Reed. The chameleon had not only murdered a mother and her children who were strangers to him, he had, it appears, murdered his own little girl and left her in a barrel beside them. And her identification, when it finally came in 2025, did not so much close the case as open a fresh wound. Because naming Rae Rasmussen raised a whole new set of questions that investigators are still working to answer. About her mother, Pepper Reed, and about exactly when and how a little girl born in California in 1976 ended up in a barrel in the New Hampshire woods, thousands of miles from where her life began. Some mysteries, it turns out, do not end the moment you finally learn the victim's name. They only become more human. What stays with you about Bear Brook is not a single act of violence. It is the silence around it, the staggering, decades-long quiet in which 4 human beings simply ceased to exist in the world's memory. And it is the quiet courage of the people who refused to let that silence be the end of the story. The detectives who kept the case file alive long after it was reasonable to. The volunteer sleuths and genealogists who spent years building family trees out of strangers' DNA, chasing a name through a thicket of distant cousins. It is worth pausing on what their persistence unleashed. The same method that finally named the Allenstown 4, first proven in a criminal case right here, has since been used to crack hundreds of cold cases across the country, to put names to the nameless and faces to killers who believed time had buried them for good. Brook was the proof of concept for a quiet revolution. And the 4 victims in those woods, who waited so long for someone to simply know them, became the reason countless other victims would not have to wait as long. Because a name is not a small thing. A name is the difference between a victim and a person, between a case number and a daughter. Marlise Honeychurch was a young mother. Marie was 6, Sarah was 1. Rhea was a little girl who never should have had to fear the one man who was supposed to protect her. 4 lives reduced for decades to a grim shorthand. The woman in the barrel, the children in the barrel, and then, slowly, restored to the people they had been. A young mother, 2 little sisters, a child of the killer himself. None of them got justice in a courtroom because the man who took them was already dead. But they got something that, in its own quiet way, matters nearly as much. They got to be known again. And in being known, they stopped belonging to the man who killed them, and started belonging to the world again, to history, to the record, to anyone willing to say their names out loud. Marlise, Marie, Sarah, Rae. 4 names a killer spent decades trying to erase, and that no amount of time and no false identity could keep buried forever. For decades, a killer's greatest weapon was anonymity, the certainty that no one would ever connect the bodies in the woods to the lives they once belonged to. In the end, the science he could never have imagined took that weapon away from him, and gave 4 people back the only thing he had truly stolen: their names. So I'll leave it with you. A killer chose victims so isolated that he erased an entire family and no one noticed for 30 years. And it took a technology that did not exist in his lifetime to finally name them. Does justice even mean anything when the man responsible died in a cell under a false name before he could ever answer for it? Tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me which case I should look into next. There are still so many people in barrels and ditches and case files waiting for their names. If the Allenstown 4 stayed with you, take a second to subscribe, because there is always another story that deserves to be told properly. Thank you for staying with me to the end.